it's JavaScript, so we need to go through it. And it's all programming languages have scope, concept of scope. So there are two types of scope. There is a functional scope and there is a global scope. And JavaScript has functions. So we have a function scope. Each variable creates each function creates a scope, a new scope. So it's like a container, and inside of the container, it has, it knows about its things, right? Things. Scope determines the accessibility and visibility of these variables. So sometimes these variables are nested inside this container. They're not visible to the outside world. They're inside of that, local to that function, local to that scope. There's another concept of global scope where global is visible to everybody, right? So you may have a variable that's defined very early on in your program that every line of code in your application can reference back. And maybe you might have something like some tax constant or something like that, or some utility method that might be checking whether or not the user is administrator or not. That's a global, something in the global scope. So variables defined inside a function are not accessible, visible from outside of the function. So what that means is that if I have a function, let's just close plural side out. And all right, so let's take a look at this guy. Right. So what it's saying is if we have inside of one of these functions here, we have, we can even make it more simple than this. We can have a function called hello world. Hello world. And inside of that hello world, there is a message. And the message is hello. So what we're saying is that this variable right here is only local to this function. It is not visible, it's only visible from in there. If I were to try to go and console log message, it's gonna give me an error because it's not defined in the scope. Let's take a look. All right, so what happened? So message is not defined, right? So it's not allowing me to get at that, right? Hello world is actually defined in the global scope as a function. So if I call it, it'll actually give me something back. Let's see. So it's not outputting anything, right? Because it doesn't console log anything. So if I console log this message out there, right. So this one is going to fail because right now it's undefined. It doesn't know where this guy is. Internally here, it knows what it is, so it's going to output because it knows it is aware and can message is visible here. But outside of it, it doesn't, because this right here is called local scope. And outside of this, everything that's outside of that guy is called global scope. So right now, it's not going to be able to see it. Doesn't matter what we do, it's not going to be able to see message, right? So we can't see that. So if we need to refresh it, actually, it'll probably work. Hello world, hello world. Invoke that, it says undefined. Right. So this is what the global scope is, message. So what it's saying is that we would need a variable here in the global scope, whether it's up above or whether it's below. This could be something else, test, right? And this is not invoked, so it's not going to do anything. But right now, my expectation is this. This is now this is a global variable. When I get down here and I call it, it basically ignores all of this, such that we just have these two things happening, right? So if we go to refresh this now, right? See here, my console test, right? Could say global scope, global message. If I restore my code block there, and we could say this is a local message, global message is the only one that's found because that is the only one it knows about, because it's basically, this is contained inside of there. And this message is now, if you look at it, it's actually referring to the one that's in the outer scope, which is the global scope. This can be the root of many bugs for sure. But if I were to do invocation, doing a call this, I want to call this hello world in this manner, I would probably get my local variable now because I'm actually executing this line, which goes to this function call. We'll execute this and console log out. So you can see I have a global message, I have a local message. So I have two different things happening there. They have the same variable name, but they're not impacting each other. And that is something, that's a very kind of light overview of what scope is, but we'll talk more about that. So this is some theory now. And this really is, some of this might not be coding, but it's more a theory on how JavaScript defines scope. Sorry, I had a chat question here. Can two functions have a variable with the same names with local scope? Yes, they can. Yes. Yes, they can. So two functions, the question is, if we had two functions, let me get out of this thing, get out. Yes, so if I had another function here that I can have 100 functions that have a variable message inside. It doesn't matter because this is called a display message. It doesn't matter because it's encapsulated inside of that function now, that container, right? Think of them as containers. They're packages that need to be called. So I need to know that I can not overwrite this object in here. This container is hidden from me unless I invoke it, as well as these things. So there's a concept of object-oriented programming that you might not know, but there are concepts in there called public variables and private variables. And public are such things as message right here. They're public to the world. Private is private to the function itself, private to the scope. So this would be considered like a private variable. It's private or local to this container. This is local to this container. So therefore, these cannot overwrite each other. However, this one is global. So that one can be affected. That can be affected. It could be affected directly. But yes, so to answer your question, yes, you could have that many different ways, many different times. Is it best practice in development world to have similar names? You know, you may have, if it's inside of its local scope, it doesn't really matter as long as it's descriptive. I mean, you got to remember, you might have a very big project with a lot of scripting. You may not have visibility on this one. It may be hundreds of thousands of lines of code up. So really, it doesn't really matter as long as inside of your scope, it's well defined. Now we're looking at these side by side, so we're just like, wow, that's a lot of duplication. But however, in a big program, you might not have visibility on that, and that's perfectly fine. It's all right as long as it tells a story inside of your code that I can look at that and see what it's doing. Right, so that looks a lot of code. That looks like a lot of scripting to me. If you're not used to coding, that looks like a lot. All right, so two types of scope. We said local and global. Visibility of these variables. So it's the visibility and not accessible from outside of our scope. So we just went over something called local scope. So variables declared inside of a JavaScript function become local to the function, or private. So down there, that example there, the car name is encapsulated inside of my function. It can use it in any calculation within where it's visible. Outside of it, it cannot access it outside because it doesn't know about it. So local variables are only recognized inside their functions. Variables with the same name can be used in different functions. With the same name, as we asked, local variables are created when the function starts and deleted when they completed. So when it runs through the invocation or the execution of this package, it'll be alive. It'll be visible. It'll be known. but after the execution leaves from this function call, then there's no more reference of that car name, for example. So it does a little bit of cleanup after it's executed. So yeah, this is a bigger, this is theory now. This is theory. So there is a concept of shadowing. This is now introducing things you may or may not have heard of before, but it's good to know them so you can avoid bugs. So this one's called variable shadowing. This occurs when a variable of an inner scope is defined with the same name as the variable in the outer scope. In the inner scope, both inner scope variables can overlap. It should be avoided. So it's kind of saying that if you have something global that could be called, something like HST tax, you should probably not put it inner scope if you can avoid it, because you may end up having some situation where you're overwriting something in the global scope. So this is where we're getting at here. So this is where this gets dangerous here, is if you define something up here with a variable name, right? You're defining it. That's an assignment here. This is saying that this message is a new variable. Inside of here, the var keyword protects it. It keeps it inside. It's saying that I'm creating a new variable called message within function. However, if I remove this keyword, now I'm directly affecting because it's going to look what message is, and it's going to roll up to the top, and it's going to say now I'm affecting that value. So if I go and run this, the expectation you might have is that it's going to be global scope. Let's see here what happens when I run this test.html global scope. Oh, I didn't invoke it, did I? Oh, okay, right here. See, if you notice, at that point in time, it hasn't been invoked yet. So this hasn't executed at all. This package has not been called. We can just basically get rid of this one if we want to make it more cleaner. If we don't call this at any point, if this was not even there, then it would just keep and respect the global scope message, right? However, if we do execute this block, then it will overwrite this message with the local message. So let's look at that. Let's actually take this out here, and we'll forget about this, and we're just gonna say what happens when we call this, and let's call it twice, before and after. All right, so before and after, if we go to we refresh this, it has a global message, and now it's local. Okay, well, it looks like something's happening. If we just get rid of this entirely to not confuse us, we're saying we define this up top here as global. Now I'm invoking this function, which is going to go and modify the storage, the placeholder in memory, and it's going to give it a local message, which we don't want. This is bad. This is really bad, because you may have some type of, so if we refresh it now it's local. So that's a side effect. We don't want that. That's a situation where that's dangerous, because we could have something up top here that is very critical. That could be something like, it could be something like a tax rate, or something like some calculation, right? A tax rate, or a discount. Maybe there's a discount that we're giving everybody for Black Friday for the shopping holiday here. It might be something like, 50% off, right? 50% off. We've advertised 50%. Everyone is expecting 50% when they come and buy something from our store. And then somebody in their code says, okay, well, now the discount is 0, right? And that's a problem, because now when people come to our site, the calculations are going to be off for them because someone in their code went and modified that, right? So now it's 0, and that's what we don't want. How can we fix this? Well, we're not going to modify. We're not going to modify that global variable. We're going to put a var in front of it. So we're doing an assignment, therefore keeping it inside of this container and not affecting the global scope. So that's what shadowing is. If you notice, shadowing is where you kind of overwrite what's expected. And this is a very small example, but you may have a very big code base where there's a lot of functionality and logic based on these global variables. So, and again, there's other ways to protect this in the script, but this is just showing that you could kind of overwrite and shadow what the original intent of the message was, or the discount value. And that is called shadowing. All right, so we are gonna get into some interesting stuff. Let's see how far we get, to be honest with this. We may just go to functional expressions and take a break, but this is a heavy concept, so might as well go through it. So we have this concept of shadowing. So we're saying there's an outer scope, the inner scope, and the outer scope. This is what happened when we called that method and we overwrote what was in the outer scope, the global scope. And we want to try to avoid that. So here we have that example, same thing. We have something called a book title, which is called the Petit Prince. And if we console out log this at this point, it's unaffected. It'll execute through here. It will just register this block of code, but it will never trigger it automatically, right? We have this function keyword, we have the name of the function, we have this parentheses that says there is no parameters in there, and then we have our start of our code block. This is the functional body. The body has a assignment, which is a book title equals the little prince. But if you notice there, it doesn't have a var keyword, so it's actually going to try to shadow the value of that. It's going to overwrite it. It's going to console log it. So if we invoke this function by name, so display block book English, and this is the invocation statement that says, okay, I need to call this guy. When I execute inside of here, it's going to overwrite what's in the outer scope, and that's what we don't want. So we're overwriting the variable. In fact, we're overwriting the global variable, which is it's a no-no, to be honest. It should be avoided at all costs. All right, so same variable here being assigned, same variable being assigned the same value in two different scopes. You don't want this. Console log is in the global scope, not the functional scope. So up here, it's outside of this guy, and it directly knows what it needs to output at this point in time, because the compiler will read the lines of code and execute as it goes. Execute this, register this call block, but don't do anything with it. When it hits here, it will call it, invocation, and then when we try to console log this value that we expect it to be Petit Prince, it's been altered. And that's what we don't want. So function scope has reassigned the global scope variable even though we exited out of the function, because we didn't protect this with a var keyword. If we had put a var keyword in front of it, it would know that this would be local inside of that block. That's called variable overwriting or shadowing. So to prevent this from happening, we need to simply declare a new variable inside of the function. So this is circled right here, var, right there. We're going to create a different variable inside the scope. This will be relative to the functional scope, which is the local scope, meaning it's private to that container. It's not a public variable. Then the book title that is declared in the global scope will remain unchanged. So therefore, that this will be the original value of this variable. That means it'll not change. So if we console log it at the ending with this protection in place, we should expect it to be the original value. So that's that's just a different concept. Scope definitely is a different way of thinking about things for sure. So we have this concept floating around called global scope. Global scope is the outermost scope in our diagram. It's basically where everything is registered inside of the browser. If we had our code block here, you know, we might want a couple things in the global scope that mean something to us, and sometimes they are, we'll just call them constants for now. We haven't learned that. Well, there's a keyword for that. I won't go into that at the moment, but usually if you have a constant, you kind of, you do it in capitals. Max, max amount equals 1,000, and then you might have a variable called min amount at 0, right? So that would be up front in our global scope. Now I told you something about some ES6 when we talked about JavaScript a long time ago. They have some standard to protect some of this stuff, but this is vanilla JavaScript. and we're just kind of just showing that, but you could actually put a constant in there. That's a new keyword that I haven't really talked much about, but what that does in the new schema of ECMA 6, ES6, whatever they want to call it, this basically gives us protection to say, you're not going to be able to reassign this. I am protecting this so nobody else can change it. This is defined only once, and if anybody tries to change it, they're going to get an error, which is a good thing, right? We never had this before. Normally, we just had the variables, right? So that would be something in the global scope. But suppose you had a browser or you had a software that, and I've had it, where we need to support older versions like of IE, like IE5 or IE6. This syntax breaks that application. So sometimes we might have to go back to variables if we're supporting other browsers. In that case, then you have the problem that you may get into where, yes, somewhere along the line, somebody can go in and just set this equal to 10 now, or 20, 25, right? So now somewhere in there, if I try to output the max amount, it's been side affected, which now it's a problem for us because in our calculations, you know, we may allow $10,000 to be the most that somebody can purchase on our shopping cart, which is amazing because we want somebody to have a $10,000 purchase. Now somebody says the most that somebody can purchase on our shopping cart is $25, which is a big problem for some businesses. So now it's $25 because somebody has decided to go ahead and overwrite it for us, which is bad news. So what they're saying is to protect that, you have to use the var keyword inside of here. So then that basically will lock it down to that scope because the assignment, this will evaluate this statement and say, what is max amount? I don't have max amount in here in my local scope. I don't have it anywhere. I'm going to look outside. I'm going to go up. Okay, I found a max amount. It must mean this. So therefore, I'm just going to brute force it and just overwrite it completely. And now somewhere in my code, there is a lot of problems. So that's what, yes, so if we were to put this variable on the max amount, and we refresh our browser, it should be 10,000 now. So now our shopping cart is back to normal. Just for anybody who's interested, there is a keyword in ES6 called constant, which is a very welcome change to JavaScript. So if somebody did actually try to do this, and we did refresh it, watch what happened. It'll actually throw an error and say, assignment to a constant error is not allowed. This is what we want, but you know, this is part of ES6. We kind of didn't learn this art yet, but there is a way to prevent some of these problems. Okay. Oh, okay, there was a question I thought, but okay. I got it. Okay, so we haven't talked about that one, but that one's good to know. Yes. Yes, go ahead, Shibam.
Hi, Mike. Okay, yeah, exactly. So there is also a keyword called let. Could
Yes,
you
yes.
perhaps also, okay, I guess you would be talking about it anyways in the coming slides. Thank you.
Yeah. I don't want to bombard everybody right now, to be honest, because there are other, so for every problem and weirdness that you can't wrap your head around when we're talking about vanilla JavaScript, there in the later releases, they try to handle some of this stuff. But the thing I want to let you know is you need to learn the quirkiness of JavaScript first to appreciate some of the newer changes because they're good, they're really good. But you have to also keep you have to also remind yourself that some older browsers, the engines, they just don't handle they can't understand the newer syntax and they just crash. So I had that. Yeah, I was learning, you know, all this ES6 syntax and the newer syntax. I'm like, oh, I'm going to go in my workplace. I'm going to rewrite all this stuff. I added it. It worked amazing. And then I got a message that I had broken IE6 for a whole bunch of clients, or not clients, the test environment. So I had to go and undo everything. But that's you know, that's a requirement for some software companies. Some software companies say, you know what, we don't support that. You guys better just get up to speed and get into a modern browser. But some financial companies and some, you know, banks and things like that, they're kind of slow to kind of adapt, you know, some of this stuff. But I was kind of surprised they're on IA6. That's pretty old. I think it's from like 2008, something like that, 2005. Anyhow, global scope. So global scope is the outermost scope. It can be accessible from the inner scope, local, anywhere really. If it's global, it can be accessible anywhere. It can be changed unless it has some of those newer syntaxes, right? A variable declared in the global scope is named a global variable. Global variables are accessible from anywhere in any scope. So counter is a global variable here. So counter can be accessed from any place in the web page JavaScript. Why you would put a counter up top in there, I have no idea. I have no idea why you'd have a counter up there, but maybe that had a logical piece somewhere in your code. You know, I'm not sure. Maybe it's a running counter of how many users, you know, check out something. You know, if you're for metrics or analytics, you know, maybe at the end of the day, somebody would grab that counter and write a report against it, and somebody resets it to 0. Then all of a sudden, all your metrics are off. That's bad. So a global scope is a mechanism that lets the host of JavaScript, the browser, Node.js, supply applications with host-specific functions as global variables. Right, so it's basically saying that this scope allows for global variables. Window and document, for example, are global variables in a browser. Yes, that's a good one to understand. Okay, because that's case in point. We've already used this quite a bit. We've already used, so I'm in the console window. As you notice right here, this is my code here. I have things related to messages and amounts. I have a function called hello world. That's all I got. I got nothing else in this code, but I do have, the browser has some APIs built in it, and there's a global variable in there called window. So there is a window. So if I actually have that, it's already registered. So if I say what is the window, it actually kind of gives me some information that this is a window, and this is referring to the browser window. Inside of that window, we already use prompt, right? So prompt, the thing that we've already been using already, is already built in. We don't have to, we just have to access it. And that would be a good example of something that is a global variable, right? I triggered that just from my console log inside my browser. I didn't, if this was, didn't matter what this is. It could be, you know, it could be a different, it could be, well, not there. It could be this site here, right? This is a shopping site. So if I have console log here, right? This is a page I just loaded up. I clear my console. I should have window there. Window is there. See, it's part of the browser. I should be able to alert something here. Your site, right? So I did that on their site. They don't have anything probably written for this, but because the browser understands that in its memory, it's called global. It can be accessed from anywhere. And there's probably some other things in there you can also access, like document, and you can document dot, well, maybe not document. There's a bunch of other ones there. Document. There is something as a document. Oh, it's waiting for me to say okay. There you go. Yes, documents. There's another one called document inside of document. So when I say document, I'm selecting, you can see the entire background is now selected. That's actually giving me access to the whole DOM tree that we talked about, the HTML elements. We can actually do stuff with that. We can wire things up. So that's a really good example of a global variable and a global scope and global functions that we could use. Window. Right, that's a good one. Counter is not. Counter is not a good one. Counter is probably, well, I don't know why. Anyways, counter. So recap this. All right. If an identifier is declared in the global scope, it's everywhere. If identifier is declared in a functional scope, it's available inside of the function it was declared of. It's local, even in function declarations inside of the function. So here you can tell in this example here, we have something called global. It's equal to 10. And then we have a variable called local. That's pretty self-explanatory now. I can see what this is, and that's local to that. However, we could overwrite this one very easily. if we assign something inside of here to global, which we don't want to do. That's called shadowing. So if you kind of visualize that a little bit, so when trying to access an identifier, so there is something called a JavaScript engine. We'll talk about that in a second. JavaScript engine will first look in the current function. If it doesn't find anything, it will continue looking upwards and outside of it until it finds something there. It'll keep doing this and keep doing this until it finds it. If it doesn't find anything, it'll throw an error, but it'll basically traverse the tree like a spider trying to find something that has that variable. And if it finds it, it's going to overwrite it, unless you lock it down with some of those newer features. But global identifier is really bad idea, because they can lead to very bad conflicts, very things that get overwritten, and very messy code can be very messy. Quickly, some context. There's the JavaScript engine. So yes, there is, and when I talked about older browsers like IE6 and IE5, they run on an older engine. They run on a JavaScript engine that doesn't deal well with some of the newer features because it doesn't have references, or it doesn't really know about them. So sometimes you have to, like I said before, you have to get like polyfills or some kind of external scripts to kind of help those older engines, they're like, picture the old car, the old tiny broken down car that's like 20 years old. It kind of helps it, give it a little bit of an injector in the engine to allow it to continue to work. Usually there's other problems and you got to do other kind of fills, but if you're trying to make an older engine from 2005, 2008 work like a Tesla engine now, it's most likely not going to work. You just do the best you can, or you just tell your clients that, hey, we don't support your engine anymore. Get modernized, get a new browser like Chrome, and we'll talk when you're there. In business, it's hard to do that sometimes, especially when there's millions of dollars on the line. But that's what can happen. Okay, so let me talk about this a little bit, and then we'll take another break, because hoisting, again, is theory. It's good to know. I forget it a lot too. Even in 10 years of programming, some of these concepts, when I read them again and tell you them, it's like, oh yeah, I know about that. I realize it. When you're coding, you don't think about all this stuff. Sometimes you get weird errors and you only know from debugging why that's happening. Sometimes you don't even know why it happens. So this is like the big picture. But I don't expect anybody to really consider some of the stuff right now and the exercises that you're doing, because the exercises are very small and these are the bigger concepts, right? But we might as well talk about hoisting, because it's another quirkiness that happens. And what happens is, let's read it. In most programming languages, variables and functions need to be declared first before you use them. That is usually what needs to happen. But in JavaScript, hoisting is a mechanism where variables and functions can be moved to the top of their scope before the code executes. So it's really weird. You could have it defined way at the bottom, but if your engine says, what is X? It tries to figure out where X is, and it basically moves it to the top. It's really weird. It's very strange. I would never code in this way. It's just something that JavaScript does. It's so quirky, right? It's just something to be aware of when it's executing. So this part is done when the program is compiled before it's executed. So there's a concept when your code is being compiled, there's some reconciliation that happens before it's rendered or executed, and it does these changes, right? So the code you write will remain the same, so your file is the same. But when it hits the browser, sometimes the browser makes some changes, right? We might have noticed that with our HTML, right? When we had the body tag, or we had some code floating there, when we looked in the developer tools, we could tell the browser built the structure of the page for us and inserted our element. It's a kind of a way that it does the reconciliation when compiling. It tries to fill in the gaps, right? So in JavaScript, really strange, they do something called hoisting where they move it to the top. recap. So, so JavaScript hoists function declarations and variable declarations to the top of the scope. Variable assignments are not hoisted. Declare functions and variables at the top of your script. So this is saying that, you know, these type of things can happen, but the best practice to avoid this behavior, to avoid it, is always declare your stuff at the top. In that way, you know, you can assign it and you don't get into any weirdness, right? So declarations at the top, then you use the assignments later, or you use them later. You don't have a situation where you're doing that type of thing, right? That's a lot to take in. I got it. That's the theory part. So it is a lot to take in. I'm not gonna lie. Yes. And so what that's kind of getting at is, you know, you may have something like, if we use this example here, you might have something like this where you have max amount, max amount. Let's see if this works. Max amount right here is equals to 10,000. I'm going to console log it, and then way at the bottom here somewhere, pretend there's lots of code here, code blocks. I don't know what they are. Way down here at the bottom, I'm going to say max amount. You know, max amount is, okay, I'll actually define it down. I'll actually define it right here like this, max amount. Maybe I'll even default, I'll just leave it like that. See what happens. Normally in another language, that would fail. Let's look at what happens. Does it fail? It doesn't fail. It actually prints out 1,000. Strange, very strange. I don't know why. Why did that happen? Let me look at the source. Maybe if the source can tell me a little bit something what happened here. If I can see the file in my script bag. Oh, there we go. So it didn't actually, my code is the same. Okay, but the compiler did something else. It did that thing in behind the scenes. So it didn't actually change my coding, but the compiled code when the browser ran did that, because normally that should throw an error. In any other language, it executes downwards and it says this is undefined. The compiler will stop right here and throw a big exception, because really this is the way code should be, and best practice is way at the top, do all your declarations, and then modify them or assign them later on, right? Code bodies, blocks, right? That's really best practice. Question, is WebStorm a good IDE for JavaScript? People use WebStorm at my workplace. I don't use it. I heard it's pretty good. A lot of people don't like Microsoft or Microsoft Visual Studio Code. That's perfectly fine. You don't need to use Visual Studio Code if you don't want to. I kind of use it because I use it at work, and it's kind of a good tool, and it's free and all that. But WebStorm is perfectly cool too. So those are heavy topics, right? Yes, let me see quickly if there is anything more with, I think I demoed the lab. Right. So for question number 4 was create an HTML page with an external JavaScript in the head tag. Create 2 functions, add number and subtract numbers, and each of them will take 2 parameters. So similar to what we've done already. You need to do multiple parameters. And we're just explaining what it does. So add takes 2 numbers and outputs the result to a console. So it probably does a sum calculation. Subtract also does that. But what we have to do with this is we need to create another function called user prompt, which will use the prompt from the web API, which is this prompt here, right? That is the global message. So this will give you an example on how to use it. If you use an assignment, you can grab the result of it. So when I run my prompt, it'll actually return the value, right? So if I actually, again, we already kind of determined that window is a global variable, so we can actually say window.prompt, enter a number, right? Enter a number. So then I can enter a number in here. It can be 100. When I click OK, it'll actually give the value back. So, but if you notice the trick here is that it'll give you back a string. which is fine if you want to grab the string. But if you want to add it, you have to do something. Otherwise, you'll get this situation where you have, okay, 1000 string plus 50, right? And then that concatenates it to a string, which we don't really want. We want 1050, right? So there is another built-in object called parseInt that is here, parseInt. Again, you can search the web docs, parseInt. If, by the way, you're learning from the web docs and you're having a hard time learning from the docs, looking at code, you might not be a visual person. You might be an audio person, like a person who needs to see somebody do it and listen. Therefore, those videos on YouTube or Pluralsight that takes you through walkthroughs where you don't have to read can help you with your learning. For me, I like watching videos, so that's how I kind of learn. Sometimes if I read it, I remember getting big books, taking it like on a vacation before a job, thinking I'm going to absorb everything, and I never absorbed much at all, right? Because I don't learn well that way. I learn from videos and watching and listening, and that's how I learn. So something like Pluralsight to back up what I'm teaching, or watching YouTube videos, that may be your style of learning, right? Yes. So anyhow, you're gonna have to get a couple prompts going on. You're gonna have to grab the inputs, and you're gonna have to output them. So I have some screenshots there, but if I run it, quickly run it, exercise 4. Let me open the console window and see if I did it. And by the way, another trick too is that we don't have any mechanism now to compare strings. So if you go uppercase, it's not going to be able to match it on the lowercase. So for now, just do lowercase, just for your program until you learn the string manipulation tool. So if I say add, okay, enter the first number, all right, 100, enter the second number, 50. Internally now, this should go and call my add function that I had, and then it'll give me the sum, which is 10. It says I'm adding 2 numbers, 1050, and here's the sum. The value is actually what is expected. If I refresh it now, again, because I have to refresh my pages because I don't have any other event to trigger this, do I want to subtract? Yes, subtract. Enter the first number. All right, so I'm going to write 50, subtract 33. So now my expectation, okay, it's 17. So now I converted those numbers using parseInt. I got the string value, which was add or subtract. I did some conditionals in there. I called my other functions and I outputted the difference. I did the work. One more case is if somebody entered, okay, add or subtract, doesn't really matter now at this point. What it is, it should fail and say unknown operation entered. So if you didn't do add or you didn't do subtract, it's going to fail on you. This is a very, okay, we'll stop there. There's many ways you could really grow this out, but let's just stop there for exercise 4. Yeah, so let's take a little bit of a break because that's a lot to cover. I plan to do more lecture, but these are heavier topics, so we'll stop there. When we come back, we'll go over the lab from last night, and then we'll have a quiz, and then we'll call it a day. So let's come back around 9:15. So let's have a bit of break. All right, thanks guys.